For Halloween this year, I want to talk about what, in my opinion, is one of the spookiest and most atmospheric and most harrowing albums of all time, which is, of course, the album Caligula by Kristen Hayter, which was released under her moniker of Lingua Ignota. And this album has been a perennial Halloween classic for me. It's one where just about every spooky season I listen to at least songs from the album, if not just listening to the entire album. And so I thought it would be fun to share it because it is a really great borderline masterpiece. So yeah, thought it would be great to talk about. With that said, let's jump into the album. So the album begins with the song Faithful Servant Friend of Christ, and this one is sort of a tone setter intro to the album, where you get all of these like looping, foreboding strings, and Kristen singing some lyrics that are making a lot of like religious references and stuff, but with this sort of like dark, foreboding edge to it. Overall, the song is one of the least dark things on the album, but it does sort of have the tone of like black clouds on the horizon that are like foretelling of a storm to come. And that storm comes in the form of the 9-minute epic second track on the album, which is Do You Doubt Me Traitor. And this is where this is where the album really starts to get going, where it begins with these incredibly just ominous sounding pianos. Like if you look up the word ominous in the dictionary, it should just give you a little button where it plays a clip of the pianos at the beginning of this song, because they are just so unbelievably menacing. And over top of these extremely ominous pianos, Kristen starts delivering some very threatening poetry. How can you doubt me now? How can you doubt me? Every stone on every mountain is etched with my name. Every vein of every leaf of every tree is slaked with poison. If you rise up to heaven, I'll turn the sun to blind you. If you sleep deep in hell, I have chains to bind you. And with that last line, the delivery on it is one of the most chilling things I've ever heard in a song. Like, Kristen just sounds absolutely evil delivering that line. And, it's from these lyrics, it's pretty clear that there is somebody who she very much hates and has an incredible amount of resentment and anger and ill will towards. But at this point on the song, it's not quite clear who that is yet. But after this, we get some swelling strings that build up to this big crescendo where Kristen calls out, she makes this like almost like a bargain. She calls out to Satan and asks him to fortify her. And this basically signals that at this point on the album, she has given up on calling out to God. God feels too far away from her in whatever suffering and misery she's experiencing. And so she is instead going to this other source to look for some degree of comfort and empowerment. And that will come back throughout the album. And so at this point in the song, we've already had two different like phases, but now we get into yet another phase, a third phase, where the strings die off and we get this incredibly chaotic, noisy, industrial section complete with these pounding pianos. And on top of all of this chaos, Kristen is just screaming this refrain of, how can I break you before you break me? And she just keeps repeating this over and over and over again. And she mentions at one point that She doesn't eat or sleep. She just lets this rage consume her, and you hear that in the tone of her voice here. Then finally, after this, the song settles into a last section where we just get this single repeated thumping bass note and some more very harrowing lyrics. And at this point, I think it would be good to stop and talk about two very important elements of the album that I have not yet discussed. The first of which is the vocals, which across the board on this album are absolutely immense. Kristen is a classically trained vocalist, which in this context translates to just her voice being an absolute powerhouse of emotion, but she's not singing in like a typical, what's the word, like melodic way. Instead, the vocals on the album are very like dissonant and dramatic, very excessive and expressive. Almost to the point of like campiness, but because of just the absolute level of conviction in her voice, it never sounds goofy. And so you'll have these incredibly just over the top, almost silly lines like, "I'm the cunt killer." But again, because she sounds so like committed and so serious, it doesn't sound silly. It actually just sounds kind of scary, and it legitimately sounds like she is some kind of like goddess of vengeance, just wanting to take out her wrath on the entire world. And speaking of vengeance and wrath, the second thing that we should talk about is who this other person is who she is expressing so much frustration and anger towards. And from the lyrics and from meta knowledge, it's pretty clear that the other person on this album that the bulk of her wrath is directed at is either an ex partner or a current partner. I'm not really sure on the timeline, but like a boyfriend who is an abuser. And Kristen has been very open in interviews and stuff about her history of domestic abuse trauma. And this album basically just serves as one giant therapy session where she's just pouring out all of her grief and despair and anger and murder fantasies. And all of that anger and hatred continues in a big way onto the next song, which is Butcher of the World. And musically, this song, it has like some very grand orchestral classical instrumentation that is then mixed with these sort of very chaotic industrial elements that are very unique to this album. And lyrically, you have Kristen just screaming bloody murder with these lyrics like, "I'm the fucking butcher of the world." Just like, again, just expressing this sort of hatred of just everything and this extreme nihilism. And, you know, there's something very obscene and evocative about just the contrast between the music, which at a lot of points on the song is actually kind of beautiful, and then just the lyrics and the vocals. The lyrics being just incredibly ugly, and the vocals often just sounding like, you know, fire being sprayed directly into my ear. And yeah, again, that contrast carries over into the following song, which is May Failure Be a Noose. And this one's kind of a two-parter where the first half you have some pretty nice piano music that is then covered by this like fog of digital distortion that sort of reminds me a little bit of Abyss by Chelsea Wolfe, if you've ever listened to that album. It has sort of a similar vibe to that. But that's the musical side of things, and then lyrically we get more disturbing lyrics like, "Who will love you if I don't? Who will fuck you if I won't? May failure be a noose with which to hang you." And, you know, the lyrics on this half of the song really do sort of beg a bit of a question of whose perspective she's actually singing from at this point, because on the one hand, there's a very obvious interpretation where she is singing from the perspective of the abuser in this situation, because like these lines are very familiar talk from, you know, someone who's abusive, the sort of things that abusers say in order to keep people around, in order to like destroy the self-esteem of their victims so that they won't go looking for something better. And so there's a very obvious interpretation of that being what's going on here. But then there's also, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure there's also an interpretation in which this is Kristen singing to her abuser and basically saying, like, now that we're through, now that this relationship is over, like, who's gonna love you? You know, you're a piece of shit. Who else is gonna want to be with you? And then, you know, a line like, may failure be a noose with which to hang you, is very much in line with just the sort of hate poetry that has been expressed on the previous two songs. And so I think there's a sort of blurring of identities here, and we'll get into that a little bit more towards the end of the video when we talk about who is Caligula, but that's an interesting thing about the song that I wanted to bring up. But then, once we get through this first half, the song is not over, and there's this second half where it starts out with some very beautiful pianos that then give way to just this cavernous, pounding industrial section, which feels very euphoric, but in a dark kind of way. And then we get these lyrics that are just like, everything burns down around me, everything burns down, just repeated over and over again. After all that, we move into the next song, which is Fragrant is My Many-Flowered Crown, which is, in my opinion, just one of the most beautiful songs on the album. Like, we have some incredibly beautiful piano music, paired with some phenomenal singing, and, you know, overall, the lyrics are not exactly upbeat. The tone of the thing is intensely filled with despair. But despite that, this song feels like a bit of a respite before we get into the darkest of what the album has to offer, which comes in the form of the following track, If the Poison Won't Take You, My Dogs Will. This song is basically the point where Kristen hits rock bottom on the album, and it is by far the darkest song on here. It begins with just this towering mountain of industrial noise, and standing atop it is Kristen just wailing this incredibly chilling melody. But as haunting as this opening section is, things only get worse when it resolves into a little bit more of an ambient section in the middle of the song, where we get the one and only verse with lyrics that are written as like a letter to Eileen Wuornos, who is a convicted female serial killer who like engaged in prostitution and then murdered many of her male clients. And when she was arrested for it, she claimed self-defense. She claimed that they were trying to rape her, but that didn't fly with the jury because she was eventually convicted. But on this song, it just seems that Kristen has reached such a low point that the only person now who feels like a kindred spirit to her is this woman who kills men, which is pretty dark. And we get lyrics like, Eileen, I'll only say this once, I'm the best friend you'll ever have. I mean, just incredibly dark stuff. So will you join me? If you lay your life down, no man can take it. Abandon your body so no man can break it. Which, those lines are just basically an abuse of Bible verses to talk about suicide. Which is something that happens a lot across the course of this album, where she takes these, like, either direct Bible verses or just, like, Christian imagery and stuff, and turns it on its head to basically just express this feeling of just despair and trauma. That's something that she's talked about in interviews. I remember at one point she said that she doesn't believe in God and she doesn't believe in like Christianity, but that she basically uses like the hollowed out shell of Christianity as a way of like, I guess, holding trauma and holding like a lot of her negative feelings, which is, I don't really know what that looks like to her, but it's an interesting thing that she said at one point, and you definitely see that across this album in lines like those. And again, it's just, this just feels like absolute rock bottom. And in that spirit, she delivers probably the single most devastating lyrics on the entire album. Eileen, I'll only say this once, life is cruel and time heals nothing, which is a line that just makes my heart sink every time I hear it. This is truly the lowest point. It feels like we are just in hell at this point, and eventually the song finishes the way it started, in a very noisy place that eventually dead ends into the following track, Day of Tears and Mourning, which begins with some quiet gothic keys that almost feel like, I don't know, something that you would hear in like a Universal monster movie or something. But that's only the introductory section, because the main body of the song basically takes like the very unique, noisy, industrial sound of this album and mixes it with funeral doom to create a pretty unique experience. And, you know, there are some vocals that are buried in the mix, but you can't really understand what they're saying. So for all intents and purposes, this is basically an instrumental song. And it basically just feels like a long march into some sort of metal abyss. And at the bottom of that abyss, we find the following song, which is Sorrow, Sorrow, Sorrow. And this song, weirdly enough, actually begins with a jump scare, which is like, throughout the album, we've heard the sound of this bottle rolling around on the floor. And at the beginning of this song, we get the sound of that shattering in this really like startling, jump scary kind of way. And funny enough, like the first few times I listened to the song, it actually got me. Even when I knew it was coming, it still made me jump a few times. But this song just sort of finds Kristen in an incredibly pitiful state. She just keeps repeating over and over again, God alone knows my sorrow, 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 in this tone of voice that is just incredibly exhausted and world weary and pathetic. And the only other thing I'd mention about the song, a sort of weird detail, is that it features what sounds to me like some overtone singing, which is, if you're not familiar, is like this trick that singers will do where they will harmonize multiple notes within their own single voice by harnessing like the power of like resonance in their mouth. And this song, I'm pretty sure she's doing that on this one, and it's kind of a weird detail. It's never been like my favorite thing about the album, but yeah, it is just sort of this weird little quirk about the song. But eventually the song quietly transitions into the following track, which is Spite Alone Holds Me Aloft. This one begins with some very sinister pianos that, again, like I talked about with Do You Doubt Me Traitor, are just so ominous. Something about the way that she does the pianos on this album are just so creepy and foreboding. And those pianos serve as the instrumental backdrop for the verse where Kristen is repeating this refrain of, all who proclaim their love betray me. But as ominous as all of this stuff is on the verse, the real centerpiece of the song is the chorus, which honestly is probably the single creepiest thing on this entire album, which is really saying something because this is an insanely creepy album. But like something about just the vocals and the way that they're recorded and the way that they mix together with the background instrumentation just sounds downright demonic. It is one of the creepiest things I have ever heard, and it truly just makes all my hairs stand on end. The lyrics are pretty distorted, pretty difficult to understand, but looking at lyric sheets, they say, let them hate me so long as they fear me, which does not make the chorus any less creepy, I'll say. But we get another repetition of the verse and chorus, and then eventually the song builds to a big industrial section that's very reminiscent of May Failure Be a Noose, with some more just like metal style screamed vocals. But then after that, the song transitions into this really chilling harmonic section at the end, where Kristen's vocals are just kind of like sliding and looping and harmonizing with each other in these really eerie, mysterious, beautiful ways. But the lyrics themselves are "kill them all, spite alone," which is just like really unsettling stuff. But, you know, the music itself has a really upbeat tone to it, and that continues into the following song, Fucking Deathdealer, which is by far the shortest song on the album. And it features some, like, crystal clear notes that are being struck from some sort of, I guess, stringed instrument, not really sure what it is. And we get Kristen singing in a very almost like conversational tone that she is the fucking death dealer, which personally is the one point on the album where I don't find her like declarations to be all that intimidating or really not all that emotionally resonant either. I also think the placement of the song is weird, coming between these two massive final epic songs that come towards the end of the album. And so, honestly, I could take or leave this one. Sometimes when I listen to the album, I just skip it entirely. But what I would never skip is the final song on the album that closes things out on an epic note. And that, of course, is I Am the Beast. And this song leaves things on a very low note emotionally. If you had any hope of this album ending on a positive note or a hopeful note, this song will be sure to take that away from you. But it certainly is a high note in terms of quality, because this song is freaking awesome. And it's another two-parter. The first half of the song features some notes that I believe are coming from a harpsichord, although don't quote me on it. And Kristen comes in singing "Beast he named me, beast I am, come and claim me," which is basically just like her succumbing to the sort of labels and emotional abuse that her abuser has laid upon her. Basically just saying, like, claiming those labels for herself, which is a pretty hopeless sentiment. And then she says, "All I want is boundless love, all I know is violence," which is pretty self-explanatory and is basically like a summation of the entire album in 2 lines. But those lines eventually trigger the second half of the song, which is a very heavy finale, where the industrial elements come back in this big epic way, and it's just sounds like everything is crashing down on you. And Kristen is just screaming in the background, "Beast I am, praise me," which is a pretty unsettling note to leave the album on, because, again, she's sort of just claiming these labels that have been given to her. And, you know, she does seem to be gaining some sense of empowerment out of it, some sense of release out of it, which is sort of reflected in the very, like, darkly euphoric musical landscape. But it's not empowerment that's coming from a positive place. It's coming from a very negative, almost satanic place. And yeah, there's no sense of healing in it. And so it really does just leave you in a pretty hopeless place that will leave that sense of chill down the spine in place after the album is complete. And, you know, the album sort of ends on this disturbing note of blurring of identities, which brings me back to something I was talking about earlier, which is the final question of this whole thing, which is, who is Caligula? You know, obviously this figure of Caligula is very important to the album because it's the title of the album, and also literally Kristen has a giant tattoo of the word Caligula just like written across here, which is insane levels of commitment to the bit. But you know, it's also kind of awesome. But like, again, who is this Caligula figure? So Caligula is the historical figure, was a Roman emperor, and in doing some research to prepare for the video, I found this paragraph on Wikipedia talking about the historical figure of Caligula, and I think it is so perfect and so fitting for the context of this album. It says, for the early part of his reign, he is said to have been good, generous, fair, and community-spirited. But increasingly, he became self-indulgent, cruel, sadistic, extravagant, and sexually perverted thereafter. An insane, murderous tyrant who demanded and received worship as a living god, humiliated the Senate, and planned to make a horse his consul. And so, like with May Failure Be a Noose, there's a very obvious interpretation here where Caligula is referring to the abuser. Because, I mean, there's this sense in which, like, you know, it all started out so great. It all started out wonderful. It was super romantic in the beginning. Like, that's how a lot of those sort of relationships begin, where everything is love and everything is great. And then the abuse begins, and, you know, increasingly the person might become self-indulgent, cruel, sadistic, extravagant, sexually perverted. And so there's that very obvious interpretation where, again, Caligula is referring to the abuser in this situation. But I think there's also an interpretation in which Caligula is also referring to Kristen, because this sentence here at the end where it says, an insane, murderous tyrant who demanded and received worship as a living god, sounds exactly like what Kristen was just doing on I Am the Beast, saying, you know, beast I am, worship me. And so it's almost like, because of the pain and the suffering that she went through, she's become the very thing that she hates and fears the most. And to be clear, I am talking here about entirely just in the context of the narrative of the album. I'm not talking about the actual singer herself, who seems like a very nice person, and, you know, somebody who is not, for instance, going to live shows and pulling out her dick and wrapping it around the microphone and then getting arrested for public indecency. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. But you know, in real life, Kristen seems like a very nice person, but in the context of this album, it's like she is sort of become this monster because of what she's gone through. And to me, I think that's a pretty disturbing ending to a horror story. Anyway, go listen to the album. It's amazing. And all of you guys have a Merry Halloween. And with that said, I will see you in the next review.